Hey everyone, it's Jeremy Steiner, and today we're going to create a cellular pattern most commonly found in leaves. Now, what's special about this process is that it has multiple jumping off points that give you useful resources depending on where you are in your creation process. So we start off by creating the pattern as a tileable mask, which you can import into any program and take it from there. But after that, if you want to continue developing a material in Substance Designer, we create a simple, stylized leaf material that kind of reminds me of some lettuce. Now, once you have your cellular pattern generator, you'll be able to create an infinite amount of cellular variations that you could use as brushes or tileable masks in a render engine or in Substance Painter. Now, it's a lot of fun, so let's get started. Okay, here we are in Substance Designer. Let's create a new graph. So File, New Package, Substance Graph. I'm going to choose the metallic roughness template, and let's call this Leaf Cellular Pattern. I'm going to set the size mode to relative to parent, and the width is 4K, and then 16 bits per channel. I'm going to hit OK. So here we are with our template graph. So let's start by creating the larger cell shapes. These will blend with our smaller cell shapes to add some diversity and compartmentalization. This process that we're about to do is a great technique used to make Voronoi patterns. So I'm going to start off with a tile sampler. So spacebar, tile sampler, hit enter. Now this tile sampler is going to create small random points that will expand out to create our Voronoi pattern. So what I want to do, let's adjust some of these parameters here. So for the X amount, I'm going to change this to 7. And for the Y amount, I'm going to go with something like, let's go with 11 for now. And then I'm going to change the pattern here from square to disc. Disc in this case is a circle or a dot. And then what I want to do is I want to bring down the scale here so that there's a bunch of small dots. 0.18 is fine. And what I want to do now is go all the way down to our color parameters and change the color random property. So I'm going to drag this all the way to the right. And you notice now that our dots are different grayscale values. Now I'm going to go back up to our position properties of our tile sampler, and I'm going to adjust this position random slider to give us all of these random dots in a different spot. Still tiling. If you hit spacebar, you can check out the tiling here. But the idea is I don't really want any of these dots to intersect, or at least I don't want many of them to do so. So I'm just going to pick something like that's fine. And then what you can do is you can go back down to the color parameters and you have this mask random property. So if I drag this to the right, it's going to remove randomly some of our tiles or our circles. So I don't actually need many of these dots because I'm working on a larger cellular Voronoi pattern. So the less dots there are, the larger those cells will be. So something like 0.76 leaves me with just a few of these dots, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. So now let's use this information to expand these dots out to create our Voronoi pattern. What I'm going to do is click on my tile sampler, hit spacebar, and bring in a distance node. So spacebar, distance, and I'm going to connect this tile sampler to both of the inputs in our distance node. And what I'm going to do is bring up the maximum distance here and watch how this now expands to create our Voronoi pattern. Now, if I bring this all the way to the right and it goes to 256, you still see some gradients here. It hasn't quite filled in these shapes entirely. So you just fill this with a really high number, like a bunch of 9s, hit spacebar, and now it's perfectly flat Voronoi values. And if I hit spacebar to see the tiling, you see it tiles nicely, and we get those shapes. Now what I want to do is I want to get the edges from our shapes. And that's why in our tile sampler, I went down and chose in the color parameters to increase the color random here. Because if I brought this down so that they're all white, the distance node wouldn't really be able to calculate where these different dots intersected when they expanded. So if I bring this back up, I'll scroll all the way down to color and increase the color random back to 1, we can now get our shapes. So let's get these edges. So I'm going to click on my distance node, hit spacebar, and get an edge detect node. And this does exactly what it says it does. It detects the edges where these grayscale values differ. And so automatically you can see we're getting some roundness here. You can adjust the edge roundness to make this a little more organic looking. I'm going to go about this in a different way later on, so I'm just going to bring the edge roundness down to 0, and we can change the edge width here. I think that's fine, 1.77 for the edge width. And now I'm going to focus on making these shapes slightly more organic. And one way to make that happen is by blurring these lines and using a histogram scan node. So after the edge detect, I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a blur and a histogram scan after that. I can see we're running into our outputs here, so I'm just going to move things over a little bit to get some room. And so if I double click on my histogram scan and bring up the position, we're just going through that histogram and finding our values. What I'm going to do is bring the position up to 0.5 and bring up the contrast to 1. Now that might be a bit weird to do so, but check out what happens if I go to my blur and I bring down my intensity. As I increase the intensity of this blur, you can see that we're rounding out these corners. And so we can play with this a little bit. I can bring down the position, for instance, and increase the blur intensity. And this is just going to give us more of those rounded corners. It gives us more control with these nodes. In fact, I can increase this intensity to something like 5 and then adjust the position on our histogram scan. And you can see what kind of neat shapes and patterns we can come up with here. I think what I want to do is really bring down this intensity, 1.58 here, and then I'll bring that position back up to, if I double click the histogram scan to see what I'm doing in my 2D viewport, somewhere around 0.5. And now I've got some nice organic rounded corners here. Depends on how you want to do it. You can get a very similar effect here by using the edge roundness slider as well. So if I go between the two, that's what we get. Now our cells are looking a little too artificial and uniform, so let's distort them a little with a couple directional warp nodes. Let me bring in a directional warp node by clicking in the graph, spacebar, directional warp. And the thing we're going to warp is our histogram scan with our cells the way they are, and we're going to warp them with a noise in our intensity input. So that noise that we're going to use is a Perlin noise. So I'm going to click on my graph, bring in a Perlin noise. So I'm going to hook up this Perlin noise into the intensity input. And if I double click on my directional warp, you can see the weird black and white dots from our Perlin noise are distorting and pushing our cells. So I can change this intensity of our directional warp, and you'll notice how that warp is creating more of an organic, random shape with our cells. Now, I think these small dots from our Perlin noise are a bit too small, so let's adjust the scale parameter. If I bring down the scale, you'll see it zooms us in here. So maybe I'll go for something more like, because I want this particular warp to be a little more subtle, but have large, round, swooping warp shapes, if that makes sense. I'm going to keep this scale to around 4 so we can have this really zoomed in noise to distort our shapes. So if I double click the directional warp, you can see that slightly adjusting what our cells are looking like. Now, this doesn't seem to be enough intensity for what I want, so I can input a larger number here. So if I choose something like 50, and now I adjust the intensity slider, we're getting a lot more randomness in our cells, and that distortion is looking a lot more organic. It's also nice to note that you can change the warp angle if you'd like. So if you want to push these cells up or down in any direction, you can do that too. I'm going to keep mine for now at 0 turns and 0 degrees, which pushes everything to the left. So this takes care of our larger distortions. Now let's add some finer detail. So I'm going to do another directional warp here. Spacebar, directional warp. I'm going to plug the previous directional warp into the input, and the noise that I want to use as my intensity input is going to be something a bit more sharp. And the crystal 1 noise is perfect for this. So I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a crystal 1. You notice how we have these nice, sharp, intricate, crystal-looking distortions. So what I can do is I can bring in that crystal 1 into the intensity input and see what we got here. And so yes, you can see we're getting a lot more of that jagged, fine detail. And so don't forget we can change the scale of this noise too. So if I bring this down, just like our Perlin noise, it sort of scales things up. So maybe I'll go with something like 16. Go to our directional warp, and I can adjust this intensity. And so now we have more organic looking shapes here. If I toggle between the two of these, you can see we have our initial directional warp and now our secondary directional warp to give us that finer detail. So now that we've created those larger shapes, let's create some smaller shapes using a different method. So I'm just going to move this over a little bit to give us some space. And I'm going to start off with a cells 4 noise. So spacebar, cells, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see here now we have a Voronoi pattern similar to how we had over here and with our distance node. However, the only controls that we have with our cells 4 noise is the scale and the disorder. So with a method like the one that we used previously, we have a lot more control as to how many cells we have, what their sizes are, the position. We can use our tile sampler to continue playing with the randomness of the scale and the random position. However, with the cells 4 noise, we do have scale and disorder, but we don't have that much control. So I mentioned before, we have our larger cell shapes, but then we also want to break this into smaller cell shapes. So let's focus on those smaller cell shapes. I'm going to go to the scale parameter of my cells 4 and increase it. And that means it's going to make them smaller. Something like 27 looks pretty good. And just like before, I'm going to bring in an edge detect. So I'll select my cells 4, spacebar, edge detect, hit enter. And you'll notice we get this, and that's because our edge roundness is by default set to 4. So I'm going to turn that all the way back down to 0, and I can adjust that edge width. And this is how thick those cells are going to end up being. So I do want them to be rather thin. 1.49 looks good. And then these still look pretty artificial, so I'm going to warp them similarly to how we warped our larger cell shapes. So let me get a directional warp. Let me plug the edge detect into the input, and then I'm going to bring in another crystal 1 noise. So we're using a new crystal 1 node here instead of reusing our previous one, because I'd like to increase the scale parameter to something higher, making the distortions from the directional warp a little more precise than the one that we used down here. But it's always good practice to ask yourself, can I reuse noises or nodes that I've used previously to increase the performance of your graph? So I'm going to take my crystal 1 and pump this into the intensity input of our new directional warp. Let's see what we got here. Now the intensity is way too high, and I want to check the scale here. I'll start by looking at it at 32, and let's just bring down the intensity. So a little goes a long way here. I can bring the intensity to 0 and bring this up to 1. That's pretty good. I think somewhere around 3 or 4 is all that we need. Okay, looking fairly decent here. We can look at this differently as well. After our directional warp, I'm going to bring in an invert grayscale, and that lets us see our lines just a bit better. So you can see we have 2 different patterns here. We have our large cells and our small cells. And now what I'd like to do is offset our smaller cells based on our larger cell shapes. So it doesn't look like our small cells are stamped over the big ones. Now, this is a great way to add more realistic detail to materials that have cracks or similar Voronoi patterns across the entire material. So I'm going to add a directional warp to our invert grayscale, which is on our small shapes here. So spacebar, directional warp, and that's going to automatically plug it into the input. But what are we going to use to warp our small shapes? Well, we need to generate some random grayscale values from the larger shapes using the flood fill nodes in Substance Designer. So what I'm going to do is get a flood fill node here. So spacebar, flood fill. Now what I want to do is connect our directional warp into our flood fill node. So because all of our cells here are basically white islands separated by a small black channel, the flood fill node is able to recognize that each of these are separate pieces. Now, what do I do with this information? Well, there's a bunch of flood fill family nodes. So if I hit spacebar and type in flood fill, you can see we have all kinds of nodes that take flood fill information in here. So we have flood fill to position, flood fill to grayscale. We can do random colors and gradients. It's great to check all these out to see what you can accomplish. What we're going to use now is the flood fill to random grayscale node. So if I plug in, you see it wants to get flood fill information here. If I plug in the B-box output into this flood fill input, you see we now have random grayscale values here coming from our cells. Now you might be asking, why didn't I go back to something like our distance node, which already has that information? Well, we've done a lot of processing through this. We've warped it. We've added an outline by using the edge detect. So doing it this way allows you to take these shapes that already have all of this processing and get you back to something similar with these random grayscale values. So let's hook up this new random grayscale map that we've made and plug it into the intensity input of our new directional warp. And so now if I double click this and I adjust the intensity, you can slightly see that we're offsetting those smaller cells by our larger cell patterns. Now let's increase this to something like 300. This gives us a much larger scale of our slider here, so I can really see what's going on, and I can just mess with this to see what kind of pattern I'd like to get. I can also adjust the warp angle to see if I can get something that I'd like. You can always adjust this after the fact. So I think an intensity of 300 was fine, and I've just adjusted the warp angle a little bit. Now let's combine the two by blending them together. So let's get a blend node, spacebar, blend. And let's take the directional warp from our small shapes and put it into the foreground. And I'm going to move our flood fill stuff up here for now and get the directional warp from our large shapes and plug that in to the background. Now you'll notice that we still have this inverted and these big ones not inverted just yet. So what I can do is I can invert these to make sure we're dealing with the same kind of information. So I'm going to select the connection between the directional warp here from our large cells and this new blend, hit spacebar, and type in invert for an invert grayscale. So now these are both inverted. So what I'm going to do is go to our blend node, and I'm going to change the blending mode of our blend node to add. And as soon as I do that, you can see I can change this opacity here. We've now successfully combined these lines together to make it look like we have large cells with smaller cells compartmentalized in the way that we'd like. Let's take a look at what we're doing in our 3D view, seeing as we haven't used it at all so far in this video. So I'm just going to move these things over a little bit, and I think I'm just going to look at the color information on a cube here. So I'm going to take the uniform color that we have and just move it to the side and connect our blend node here to the base color output. And that's going to attach it here and view it in our 3D view. That's looking really cool, actually. I can also take a look at this by going to Scene and going to Rounded Cylinder. And usually a rounded cylinder is how I like to view things because it has curvature but also a flat space as well. Gives me the best of both worlds. Now there's one more thing I want to try in terms of viewing our material here, and that's by tiling this material twice without changing anything in our graph. And this just shows me what it looks like in the 3D view with this pattern repeating or scaled down, and I don't have to worry about changing any parameters or properties later on in my graph. So I'm going to go to Materials, Default, and Edit. And that was all done with the menu in our 3D view. And then I have these properties over here appear. You see I have this tiling parameter, and I can increase this, and it's just going to tile this multiple times over our 3D shape that we're dealing with in the 3D view. So I can double click this to select and change the value here in the tiling property and change it to 2. And you'll see now it repeats across the whole thing twice. And I think this is a good way to look at this material. Having it back at 1, if I just hit the reset button, it's a little zoomed in, and I think I'm going to want to probably apply this material scaled down a little bit. So I'll take this back and set it to 2. So if I just zoom out a little bit with the scroll wheel and see what we have so far. What I like about this process is that you have different stages that you can stop at that provide you with useful resources in your pipeline. And what I mean by that is right now we have a black and white mask that can be used in other applications. If I hit spacebar, you can see it's tiling and it's perfectly usable. So some examples could be that you could import this into Unreal Engine and build a shader in there, or you could apply this material to a mask in Substance Painter. You could use it to drive the color, subsurface scattering, anything you'd like. Now, as an extra option, here's a quick process to add a little more detail and dimension to this mask. I'm going to select everything we have so far before our outputs and give us a little more room. And then after our blend here, I'm going to bring in something called a non-uniform blur grayscale. So spacebar, non-uniform. You see we have that non-uniform blur grayscale. The non-uniform blur grayscale node is extremely useful. It can provide some realistic depth to your mask if you'd like to use it as a height map. It will round out the edges and corners with a soft gradient to make these lines more like veins or pipes. So let's see what it does. So if I take the output of our blend and I plug it into the grayscale input and also the blur map input of our non-uniform blur grayscale and double click, let's see what we got. Well, the intensity is a little high here, so let me just take down the intensity. And you can see what it's doing here. It's added that soft gradient. And if this were a height map, you would see that these are rounded off so that they look more like veins or pipes. So what I'm going to do in the parameters here is increase the samples all the way up to 16 and the blades all the way up to 9. And I can finely tune and adjust this intensity. Even something as minute as 0.7 here in the intensity still adds some great information here if I zoom in. This is great, but I think I want to add just a little more distortion and organicness to this. So what I'm going to do after the non-uniform blur grayscale is bring in another directional warp. And the noise that I'm going to use is another crystal noise, crystal 1, but I'm going to bring in another one because I want to change the scale again. So spacebar, crystal 1. Let's hook this up into the intensity input. And I think I want to really increase the scale here. Okay. So I'm going to pick something like 52 because I really want these small edges warping what we have so far. And let's bring down that intensity. And we only need a little bit. So 1.17 here, if I switch between the two, just gives me a little bit more of that detail. And now, as I look at these lines are so clean and nothing organic really looks this clean. So let's add some noise here. And I'm going to do that with a slope blur grayscale. So spacebar, slope blur grayscale. Excellent node. And I'm also going to bring in a clouds 2. Just like the directional warp, the slope blur grayscale requires a noise as its slope input. And this is what distorts the input using these parameters. So I'm going to plug the directional warp into the grayscale input and the clouds 2 into the slope input. And right away, we get this mess. So I'm going to increase the samples. It's basically like the resolution or iterations of this filter. So I bring the samples all the way up to 32, and I'm going to highly bring down the intensity. And we can zoom in to see what it's doing here. This is something that you probably have to type in a parameter for instead of use the slider because it's not quite sensitive enough. Maybe something like 0.02. And now I get some nice noise around the edges here. If I switch between the two, that's the clean version, that's the slope blurred version. Nice detail there. And so after these steps here with the non-uniform blur, directional warp, and the slope blur, this completes our more detailed version of our mask. Now, both the original and the detailed versions have their place in a pipeline depending on what you'd like to use it for. So I'm going to comment these just so we can establish the certain stages in our graph. So this is our blend node where we combined our big and small shapes together. I'm going to right click that and say add comment, and I'm going to call this mask. So you can see that adds a small little comment there. And I'm going to do the same thing over here to our slope blur grayscale. Right click, add comment, and I'm going to call this detailed mask. So at any point you can click and find, okay, this is where I could export this mask, or I can export the detailed version with the height information and the non-uniform blur. Excellent. If at any point you'd like to export what you're seeing in the 2D view, you can double click on something and click on this floppy disk icon just to save this as a bitmap. And if you want to export any of these stages, go ahead, double click, and then click on the floppy disk to export it out. As the final part of this video, I thought it would be fun to apply some of our Substance Designer skills and create more of a finished material. Why not quickly create a simple leaf pattern using the masks that we've created? Now, there are many use cases for the cellular leaf pattern that we've made, but here's a simple way to make a stylized material for any close-up leaf shots that you might have. So what I'd like to do to keep organized here is I'm going to select all of our nodes here before our outputs and hit spacebar and type in frame. So I'm going to make a frame around all of these, and this is how I keep organized in my graphs. And so what I'm going to do is go to the title here, and I'm just going to call this cellular pattern. And I think I'm going to keep with the green theme here and just make it green. So now I'm going to do something I don't usually do, and that's start off by creating the albedo color information first. So I'm going to go with a simple green color that has some sporadic dark and light values. And in this case, I'm also going to make the veins a bit of a lighter color. So I'll show you what I mean as we go along. So right now I'm going to get rid of that uniform color that we had from our template and maybe just make some room by moving all of this over. First thing I want is another clouds 2 noise. So spacebar, clouds 2. And I'm going to keep the settings as default. Next up, what I'm going to do though is after the clouds 2, I'm going to bring in an auto levels. So spacebar, auto levels. And this does something kind of like what you would do in maybe Photoshop or maybe the Photos app on your phone. It adjusts the values in the image so that it maximizes the total use of the histogram. So you can see our darks and lights just become a little more contrasty. And the reason why I want to do that is because I'd like to get the maximum amount of grayscale information in this noise to drive the gradient map node that I'm about to use to remap my colors to these values. So let me get that gradient map node now. I'm going to hit spacebar, gradient map at the top there, and I'm going to go to my gradient editor, and I'm going to use the pick gradient option and select some colors from a leaf image. So I've just gone to Google here, and there are plenty of leaf images to choose from. I'm going to choose this one, and what I can do is I'm going to take my pick gradient button and then just drag across a small part of this leaf. And I'm mainly aiming for just the green parts and not the light veins in between everything. So I've gone ahead and I've just slightly dragged across that spot. I got 2 keys here and I made sure that my precision is pretty low. And that's pretty much all you need. And that's because we have that auto levels here giving us a lot of contrast. You could use a levels node if you wanted to adjust it even further. I thought this was fine. And so you can see that our light green to dark green is being mapped, and you get a nice variation here, kind of organic, swirly, cloudy background. Now let's add on our veins or our cellular patterns that we've made. So I'm going to get a blend node here. We're going to be adding on these shapes, so I'm going to get the gradient map and put it into the background, and then find our detailed mask here and plug that into the foreground. Now you notice we have this red dotted line, and that's because our slope blur grayscale is outputting grayscale information, and we can't blend color information, which is this orange connection, with the gray. We can have two of the same, but we can't have one of each. So what I'm going to do is select the connection from our grayscale information and bring in a gradient map node. And this automatically converts that grayscale information you see here to that orange output or color information. That's a quick way to convert grayscale to color information. So now if I go to my blend, I can change the blending mode to add. And so now as I increase the opacity, you can see that the light values from our cells is being added onto the gradient map, and I can just fade on the light veins or cells onto our gradient map. I don't really need that much here, so maybe something like 0.28 looks good. We can always check this out by connecting what we're doing into our base color output to see what's going on in our 3D view, and I think that's looking pretty good actually. So we've got our color information. Now let's use our cells mask information to create our height information. So what I like to do, we have 3 bits of information that we need to generate height information for a material. We have our normal map, our ambient occlusion, and of course our height information. And so to make it so that we can connect one input pin from what's going on over here and distribute it to these 3 different outputs, I like to create something called a final blend. So I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a blend node. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this blend to the normal conversion node here, and I'm going to remove these 2 uniform colors from our template because we need to provide our own information here. So I'm going to hit delete and delete those. For the ambient occlusion, we can't just connect our height information and generate those shadows automatically from this output. We need to generate it with a node that does that for us. So I'm going to hit spacebar and type in ambient occlusion. Now, if you're using a later version of Substance Designer, you're going to have 2 versions here. Depending on how fast your machine is or how quickly you'd like to get some things done, you can choose the height-based ambient occlusion or the ray-traced ambient occlusion. For now, I'm going to choose height-based because for this particular example, the difference isn't striking enough for me to go for the processing power of the ray-traced version, so I'm just going to choose the HBAO version. I can connect that HBAO ambient occlusion node to the ambient occlusion output and now connect our blend to that ambient occlusion node. And then I'm also going to connect our blend to the height. Now, it looks a bit crazy here. We have different colored connections and dots going on, and that's because our blend doesn't know what kind of information it's dealing with. It could be either color information or grayscale information, but as soon as we plug something into this, it's going to figure itself out and fix all of our connection errors here. So now all we need to do is connect something into our foreground here for it to distribute to these 3 different outputs for us, which is really handy. Now, before we do that though, we need to make some adjustments. So I'm going to go to our mask here, our original one, the one that doesn't have the detailed information. And I'm going to branch off a connection from that mask and bring in an invert grayscale. So you can see now that we've inverted it, we have our veins, which are going to sink into the material, and we have our cells, which are white now, which will pop out from the surface of the material. And now the reason why I'm using the mask without the extra detail added onto it is because I want to use another non-uniform blur grayscale to round this off and make it a little more clean looking. So I'm going to go to our invert grayscale here of our first basic mask here. And I'm going to bring in that non-uniform blur grayscale. Again, I'm going to connect both of our inputs here. You can see we're getting some really cool information. It's a little bit pixelated, and that's because we need to go to the samples and blades and increase those. So I'm going to increase the samples all the way up to 16, the blades all the way up to 9, and then I'm going to dial back that intensity. And it's getting a really cool result. I think 3.92 looks good. So now you see we have lots of nice depth here from our cells. So let's see what we've done so far. I'm going to plug that non-uniform blur grayscale into that final blend that we created in the foreground here. Now you can start to see we're getting a really cool scaly kind of material from those cells. And you can see how it's bumping out based on how we created that height map. I want to make a couple of adjustments before we go any further here, and that's to do with how these nodes here are interpreting the information and distributing it out to our outputs. Right away, I'm noticing that our ambient occlusion node is way too strong. So I can decrease the height depth here, and that's going to remove some of those shadows those fake shadows that it's creating. We only want a tiny bit. 0.01 I think is just enough because we're getting a nice rounded look here. I also want to take a look at the normal, and this is the normal conversion node connected to our final blend. We can adjust this intensity, and I can either decrease it or increase it. I think for now I'm going to want to actually increase it just a tiny bit. 1.35 looks okay for now. Kind of looks like a bunch of raindrops on a windshield or something like that. So now, just with this non-uniform blur grayscale from our mask, we've created that height information. And we've got some nice big bumps here, but now let's add some micro bumps for a little bit more height detail. And what I'm going to do is bring in a fractal sum base node. Fractal sum base. And the fractal sum base node gives us lots of control when creating really neat noises like this, where I want to create some small bumps here. It takes a lot of the fractal sum nodes and combines them together so that you can do a lot of things with just one node and a couple of parameters. For instance, I can bring up the roughness here to 2, adjust the max level here because this really adjusts the resolution of our noise. And I kind of want some softer, relatively small bumps. So maybe a size of like 9 here for the max level. Okay, and it's looking pretty flat. So what I can do is add a levels node after the fractal sum base, and I can adjust these top left and right triangles to add more contrast in. I can fiddle with this for a little bit, just so I can get more light and dark values here. So I think that's looking pretty good. What I could also do is go back to the fractal sum base and adjust this global opacity value, and that lightens and darkens the noise. So 1.08 there, add the levels, and that was looking pretty good. Now, let's blend our levels with our height map that we have so far. So blend node, I'm going to put the levels in the foreground and the non-uniform blur grayscale into the background, and change the blend mode to multiply. So now, before I adjust this opacity, I'm going to plug this new blend that we just created into our final blend here, connected to all of our outputs. You can see what it does. It's added those small bumps, and what I'll be able to do now with our new blend is bring down that opacity if I'd like to. Let's see, I could dial it down a little bit. I think I actually liked it at 1. Because if we zoom out here, you get some nice juicy detail. Up to you though. Now it's definitely looking a bit shiny, so it's time to focus a bit more on our roughness. And so let me just move these things over a little bit. And now I'm going to focus on the roughness output. You can see we have a uniform color from our template, and if I bring up that grayscale value to closer to white, it's less of a shiny material than if we bring it down to the darker values. So I'm going to use this uniform color to set the baseline for where I want my roughness to be. But I do want to add some variation here because nothing is completely the same roughness, not usually anyway. So I'm going to get a blend node here, a new one. And I'm going to connect this uniform color that was already connected to the roughness. I'm going to plug that into the foreground of this blend. Now for the background, I want to get some random information here, which we already have from this fractal sum base and this levels. So I'm just going to take this levels and get a new connection and connect it to the background of this new blend for a roughness. And now if I double click on the blend, I'm going to leave it on copy. In fact, let's connect our blend to the roughness output here on the right. And so if I adjust this opacity, I can let some of that noise that we generated come through. And this lets us control the overall roughness. I can change this roughness down to something a lot more dark. And now overall the material will be a lot more shiny. If I control shift and right click, I can rotate the light here. I can bring this back up. And while still getting some of that variation, it's a lot less shiny. That's a nice way to really give yourself some control. And it's a great example of reusing nodes that we've already created. So this is what our material looks like so far. And I can move that light again, control shift right click. And now as an added bonus, if you're working on the underside of a leaf, you can invert this height information. So if I go find my height information here, which is down here, there's the non-uniform blur with the noise that we added going into this final blend here. If I click the connection between these two blends and bring in an invert grayscale, it now looks like we're looking at the underside of the leaf and the veins are more closer to the surface while the bumps are pressing inward. So you can click on this invert node and just change it from true to false, false to true, depending on what you're working on, and you get two materials in one. So to review everything, we've created a cellular pattern, starting off by doing a basic Voronoi operation with a tile sampler, using the distance node, and doing lots of manipulations with directional warps, as well as creating smaller cells with these cells Voronoi, grabbing those edges and doing some continued warping and distortion. We even used the flood fill nodes to create a distortion map for our warp. And we also made a detailed version of this mask that we created using a non-uniform blur grayscale and also a slope blur grayscale. We then used these two different masks and applied it to creating our own material here. So we created our color information with a gradient map and a clouds 2 noise. And then we also created our height information with our handy non-uniform blur grayscale, some noises, and pumped that into our final blend. We were also able to reuse that fractal sum base and levels node to adjust our roughness. And we did that to create a very stylized, simplistic, almost lettuce-looking material. I think this is a great jumping off point. If you'd like to take this lettuce material further, you could add some subsurface scattering in your render engine and use the black and white mask as an intensity input, although you might need to invert the mask to get the results you want to get there. Now, you could also use the albedo for the scattering color. There's really a lot of possibilities with what we've created today. Now, initially, I created this technique when I was working on a project that required me to texture a plant where I knew the camera was going to be very close to the subject. Now, I ended up exporting the black and white mask as an image and imported it into Substance Painter. I could then apply that to some layers, create some masks there, and add some hand-painted variation. I think it's a great example of using proceduralism and hand texturing together. Now I'll never have to make that cellular pattern again, or I could just change that random seed of my graph to get multiple variations of that particular pattern. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you're new here, welcome, hi. Hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more texturing and material making tutorials. And if you like this video, hit the thumbs up. It lets me know that you are watching and that you'd like to see more videos like these. Now that's it for now. I'm Jeremy Seiner. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.